So we've finally made it to the third part of a talk I recently gave titled Food Preservation, Canning for Beginners. If you stumbled on this episode before having the chance to listen to the 2 parts before this one, I want to encourage you to go back and give those a listen first. If you've already covered the first 2 parts, I'm so glad you've made it to this point and hope you've found the material helpful so far. In this third and final part, I take everything I've already given you and demonstrate just how easy it is to can 2 common staples most people have in their food pantries, and those are going to be beans and chicken. It really, really is a simple process. Even though this demonstration was done in person before a live audience, I believe there's still plenty to glean even from this audio recording. I hope you enjoy.
On to demonstrating how to can dry beans. And I mean, we all buy beans at the store, right? We buy cans of beans, we use them for soups, chilies, you name it, refried beans even. So this is what the guidelines are, the USDA guidelines, which again, you can go online and print this off yourself. These are the official rules. This is what they tell you. The Presto Canner manual will have many of them in there, but this is the all-inclusive. It's like the holy grail of canning, all right? These are what the professionals say. It says place dried beans or peas in a large pot and cover with water. Soak 12 to 18 hours in a cool place, drain water. I'm sorry, but I don't have 12 to 18 hours right now, so we'll skip that step. It says, or, to quickly hydrate beans, you may cover sorted and washed beans with boiling water in a saucepan. Boil 2 minutes, remove from heat, soak 1 hour, and drain. Okay, we're still up to soaking for an hour after bringing to a boil for 2 minutes. Then, the final step, cover beans soaked by either method with fresh water and boil 30 minutes. So even with the quick soak method, that's 32 minutes of pre-boiling, and then it's gonna have to sit for an hour to soak. Then it says you fill your jars and add half a teaspoon of salt per pint, 1 teaspoon per quart to the jar if desired. Fill hot jars with beans or peas and cooking water, leaving 1-inch headspace. Oh, I don't know about you, but when I look at recipes like that, I'm like, too much time. I don't want to do it. I just don't want to do it. I'm sorry, I've got way more important things to do than to mess around soaking beans. Even though I know a lot of people, this is just the traditional way you do beans, right? We always soak them. We're going to do it that way. No, let's try this way. Remember, we're going to raw pack, cold pack. And here's how we're going to do it a quicker way. All right, so it said to rinse beans. So first thing I'm going to do is, and you can time me, this should take me less than 5 minutes to do, but I'm going to sort through the beans. And what I do is I measure out a cup at a time because I'm going to do a quart, and I'm looking for broken ones. I'm looking for shriveled pieces. Basically, I'm looking for pieces of gravel. You guys have found gravel. Black beans are the worst. I find more pieces of gravel in my black beans. It's insane. But I don't want like these, little shriveled or half mauled pieces. I want them to be as whole as possible. So I'm just looking for any bad ones that are, peeled off. It doesn't take that long. You can do it quick. This is a good thing for kids to do. Line them all up and be like, hey guys, we're picking beans. Have some fun. Here's a tray. Pick out all the bad ones. And then they get excited to see who can find the most beans that are crushed. And, and then they get a special treat if they find gravel. Like, you're the winner. So you've got your beans. It's 1 whole cup. I'm just going to take some water here just to demonstrate. Normally I would do this at the kitchen sink, but I would just give them a good rinse, trying to get off any dirt, any bad stuff that's in there, just to try to clean them off. Then, of course, did I have to sterilize it? Nope. Does it have to be hot? No. That's it. Just get the jar. As long as it's clean. A good clean jar. You take it, you put your funnel in there. Okay, my jar is full of beans. That's 1 cup of beans. Now the next thing I would do is I would put 1 teaspoon of salt. I'd pour that salt in there. The next thing I'm going to do is I'm going to fill it to, what was the headspace? 1-inch headspace. I don't need to use my ruler because I know 1 inch is right at the bottom of the band. Right to there. Done. Take my lid. Does it have to be hot? Nope. Take my clean lid. I take my clean band. Doesn't have to be hot. I screw it on. Finger tight. The difference between finger tight and tightening the lid is only use your fingers. That's as tight as my fingers can do it. If you're grabbing hold and cranking it on there, you're over tightening it. Don't do that. Finger tight. Just with 3 fingers, tighten it. That's as tight as I can get it. I would take it, it would go in my pressure canner, and I would turn on the heat. That's it. This equates to having jars that come out like this. I like to give mine a little shake when I'm done because they do like to kind of get chunky at the bottom. The liquid needs to disperse in them. They're perfectly cooked. Perfect. I don't get mush, I don't get gunk, I get perfectly cooked beans, and it took me less than 5 minutes to fill a jar. No 12 to 18 hours, no need for pre-soaking and boiling and all these extra steps that was like, why? Why do we do that? Well, after I placed it inside the canner, you process it at the normal times. The lock's going to disengage. You take it out of the canner. You do all of that, and you let it sit on your shelf. And that's the finished step. That's it. That's all it takes to can beans. But what about the gas? Because we all know if you don't soak your beans, you're going to get the toots. My husband told me I had to put this in there. It was all his doing. But, today's special beans, the vow of silence, some days it was really hard to keep. Now, according to the Bean Institute, they had an article called Beans, the Magical Fruit. The more you eat, the less you toot. Okay? That's their article there. It says beans contain fibers called oligosaccharides, which are non-digestible fermentable fibers that cause gas. They make their way intact to the colon where they are fermented by beneficial bacteria. Gas is created during this fermentation process. We know that. Now, in there, they cited this study. It says healthy adults were asked to eat half a cup of legumes, which was pinto beans, black-eyed peas, or navy beans, or carrots each day for 8 to 12 weeks initially. Initially, half the people reported increased gas, but after 8 weeks, they were back to normal levels. These results suggest that while some individuals may experience gas associated with bean intake, regularly consuming beans, half a cup a day, for a period of 8 weeks may reduce bothersome symptoms like bloating and abdominal discomfort. What's the bottom line? The more often you eat beans, the less often you'll experience GI discomfort. Well, okay, we get that. So the more you eat, the less it would be, but what about soaking? How does this affect it? Well, gas-reducing tips. 1, increase your bean intake slowly. 2, drink more water. 3, when soaking beans before cooking, change the water several times, and I love this. 4, rinse canned beans. We're canning our beans. And how does it say reduce the gas when doing that? Rinse them. That's what it says. Rinse your canned beans before eating or using in recipes. Rinsing also reduces the sodium content of canned beans. All right, well, that sounds pretty convincing. But then I found this other one, the Los Angeles Times, says, don't soak your dried beans. Now even the cool kids agree. Russ Parsons said back in 2014, almost every recipe in every cookbook you've ever read says you must soak dried beans before you cook them. In almost every case, that advice is wrong. Letting dried beans sit overnight in a bowl of cold water does nothing to improve their flavor or their texture. In fact, it does quite the opposite. While soaking shortens the unattended cooking time of beans somewhat, the time saved is marginal and there are no other labor-saving benefits. Finally, soaking does absolutely nothing to reduce the gas-producing properties of beans. It's a fiber. Soaking's not going to do anything to it. It's still a fiber. What's more, few commercial canners soak dried beans before cooking. In fact, in a way, they don't cook the beans at all. The heat and pressure of the canning process, called the retort, is enough to cook, perhaps even overcook, the beans right in the can. When you look online and people talk about canning beans and stuff, you will get a lot of mixed reviews. If you look and see why the negative reviews on canning dried beans, they'll all say the same thing. They're mushy. Mine came out mushy. Texture was bad. Blah, blah, blah. Same thing with potatoes. If you dig deeper and you find out what process did you use, every single one of them will have followed the guidelines to the letter. And every one of them will come out mushy because they're overcooked. Because you had to soak them for so long, and then when you put them in the pressure canner, they're heated and cooked in that water where it's like it all gets trapped right inside of it. Now, the crazy thing is that a lot of doctors have said when you soak or overcook vegetables, all the nutrients are pulled out of it and put into the water, and they're actually not as nutritious for you. They're not as good. The vitamins have been leached out into the water, and then we drain the water away. Well, the great thing about not soaking your beans and just rinsing them before you consume them is that all the nutrients haven't been sucked out. The bean itself is cooked in whole, quickly, inside the jar with the water that you put in there and a little bit of salt for flavoring. You don't have to add salt if you don't want to, but I mean, spot on flavor, really. Just rinse them really good. That's all you have to do. Just rinse them, and they're ready to throw in whatever you want. So not only are they cheaper to can your own dried beans, they're fast. I mean, it's like a staple item. It's a good protein to have on hand. It's an inexpensive protein to have on hand. They're flavorful, all of those things, but you also get to keep the nutrients because they haven't all been leached into water from soaking and then bloating up, and then you cook them. They're gonna cook right in the jar and they expand. All of it, all the nutrients get to stay inside the bean itself, and then you get to eat that. So there's different benefits to doing it. And like I told you, just minutes and they're done. So now the other thing, that same exact principle, because again, I did not follow the guideline of soaking and putting hot water and all of that. Remember what the rule was when you do hot canning, hot packing? It's hot, 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 all the way across the board. When you do cold or raw packing, it means you get to use cold or raw packed vegetables. Pack them. You don't have to add the boiling water. You don't have to have hot jars. Just in the recipes, if they say start your canner simmering, like while you're doing your canning, you're gonna start preheating your canner. Don't do that. You don't want your water hot. You want it room temp. Just put your 3 quarts of water in your canner and you start working on your next thing. So now I'm gonna show you how, very quickly, how you would can chicken. So, we're gonna use a wide mouth jar. Again, you see, having that bigger mouth means that it's easier. I can get my hand down in here to scrub, and I got fat hands. All right, but I can get my hand down in there to scrub the sides if I need to, but it's also easier to get the chicken inside. So what you would do is you would take your chicken, and it's the boneless, skinless chicken breast, and you're gonna cut it into like 3/4 inch, it's like strips. Okay, you're just gonna make strips. If there's excess fat on there, cut it off, trim it aside. It's not like you're gonna die if you have fat inside there, but they do say that that fat will start to melt and it can creep up the inside of your jar and will spill over. And fat on the rim will definitely keep your seal from sealing. Okay, that oil, any type of residue will keep it from sealing in there. So anyhow, what you would do is you just cut it into strips and you're just gonna fill 1/4 of the jar, 1/4 ways. I'm just looking to see how much I can get in there. Once it's 1/4 fill, I use my handy dandy special canning tool. Just a whisk. It's just got a solid base on it. I love it because it works great for this. I take it, and what you have to do is, I'm just mashing it down. Again, I'm not gonna break my jar. You just mash it down, and you're trying to get rid of any air pockets. Okay, that's the idea. Mash it down. Once that's done, just go, and you're gonna keep filling up the jar. Keep going all the way until the whole thing is full. When I get to the top, then I can mash it down some more, and it'll be a-okay. Oops. And for chicken, and for most meats, you will not add, while it's doing that, you will not add water. There is absolutely no liquid in here. So you just keep mashing it down. If you feel the need to use the bubble popper, if it looks like there's bubbles in there, you can run the bubble popper through it. It's really not. I mean, it's solid in there. I've reached my 1-inch headspace, made sure it's not up above that rim. That's it. I would then take, because it's a quart, I'm gonna put a teaspoon of salt in. I would go ahead and put that in. And then after that's done, I skipped this step on the last one. You would have a nice clean, wet rag, a damp rag. And the key is, every single jar you do, you would rub that across the top. It could be a damp paper towel, something clean. And again, the issue is we don't want any oils, we don't want any food particles on the rim, as well as you are checking for cracks and dings. If there's a crack or a ding on the rim, it will not seal, okay? So you can, before you go through the whole process, just double check. So you don't waste any food where it comes out and it didn't seem like, oh man, it's got a crack in it. You're feeling for that. As you clean it, you feel it's nice and clean. If it's clean, your lid goes on. It does not have to be sterilized and hot. Your band goes on. You just finger tight. Okay, guys, don't be cranking it on there. Just finger tight. It goes inside the canner. How many quarts of water in the canner? 3. Does it matter how many jars are in there? No, it's always 3 quarts 3/4 of water. So we've cleaned the jar rims, we've put on the lids, the quart goes inside the canner. It's going to be processed for at 11 psi, so 11 on the gauge once it reaches there, and then 75 minutes for the pints. Because it's a quart, I'm going to do 90 minutes, so an hour and a half. And then again, once it comes to an end, do not remove the canner off the burner, okay? This is key. You do not want wide ranges of temperature fluctuations when pressure canning. What happens inside when that happens, if it goes from really hot and then you're like, oh, it's getting too high, and you crank down your heating element and it starts to drop really fast to cool it off, siphoning happens. And that's when the pressure regulator inside there can't handle it, and so all of the excess liquid that's building in this jar will seep out. It will pull the liquid out of the jars. And that's why sometimes in canning you end up with, this one kind of shows a little bit of it, how it looks. This had a tiny bit of siphoning happen. See how it's not all the way up to the top, the 1 inch? It had a tiny bit. And that can happen. It doesn't mean the food is bad. It doesn't. It'll just discolor because it's not submersed under the water. But you don't want it to where like half the liquid is gone because of temperature fluctuation. And that's why it happens. It's not that it didn't seal, it's just that if you try to cool it too fast or vent the pressure canner quickly because you want to get the next batch going, if you do that, you will end up with more siphoning. So leave it alone. Once it finishes the processing time, walk away. Turn your timer off and walk away. That's all you have to do. So this is what it's going to look like. You've turned the stove on, you've got your 3 quarts of water in, you've put your food in, it's in the canner, you've locked the lid, right? It's on. This is not on, okay? The weight is not on. That's when you go through venting the steam. This is what we're looking for. We're looking to make sure that steam is venting. The next step you'd be looking for then is after the steam starts to vent is when the lock engages. This is what's going to happen next in the process. Okay, the lock has engaged. The next step that you're looking for is as soon as that lock engages, it's steaming, we got a nice steady steam, okay? There's no air in there. Now we take our weight and carefully place it on there. If you need to use a pot holder on your hand, by all means do so. I always get nervous on that part because I'm like, you know, like get it on there without touching it. I don't want to touch that steam, but you get your weight on there. That's the next step. As soon as that happens, the very next thing in the order is you are waiting for the dial gauge to reach 11 psi, and you're going to wait. As soon as the pressure hits 11, that's when your timer starts. Okay? You do not start your timer until you have reached the proper psi. That's the timing. This must stay at 11 psi for 90 minutes. Does it ruin the batch if it goes above 11? No. It just means it's going to be a little bit more cooked. What happens if it goes below 11? There we have a problem. If the pressure at any time goes below the set processing time, with this case, it would be 11 psi. If it goes to 10 or 9, you have to get it back up to 11 and start all over again. So say you went, an hour in, and you walked away, and something happened, and the kids messed with the tile on the stove and knocked the heat down too low, and it dropped below the 11, you're already an hour into the processing time. You got to go back. You get the heat back up to get it set, get it 11 pounds pressure, 90 minutes. And you start all over again. This is why the beginning part of the pressure canning is the most critical timing. A lot of people out there will tell you you cannot pressure can on a glass top stove, electric glass top stove, and you guys have heard that, I'm sure. No, you can't, okay? Just be aware that it's a glass top stove, so don't be slamming your pressure canner that's full of heavy water and contents around. Don't slide it. It's heavy, okay? So common sense, think about that. The only difference between using a flame or gas stove versus an electric stove is that gas with that flame is much easier to get a consistent temperature that you can regulate easily. Once it hits the pressure, you can set it and it's not going to fluctuate. Electric is different. And I haven't really delved into all of the science behind it, but it doesn't react the same as flame. So when you lower the temperature, it has to cool off. It's not like when you take a flame away, it instantly starts cooling, right? There's no more heat. The electric stoves are still maintaining that heat. So it's hard to get the exact temperature on there. So just know your stove, know how it works. You're gonna start at like an 8 as it's building pressure, and then little by little start backing it off, backing that dial down. By the time you hit 11 pounds pressure, it's still gonna wanna creep up. Don't worry about that. It's gonna settle back, because once the jars inside there are fully heated, there's no more cool contents in there, you're gonna get higher steam pressure. So you can back that temperature down, and it'll probably stay around a 3, is my guess. On my stove, it's typically around a 2 or a 3. It's not a lot of heat that's needed to maintain, and it'll stay at 11 psi the whole time the processing time goes. Now, this is what you should hear if you keep it at the right thing. So don't be alarmed. Like, you're gonna hear things rattling around in there, and I'm serious. The first time I thought I'd shattered every glass in there. I was a mess. I mean, like, I could not wait for it to finish. I just was like, I don't know, because I kept hearing all these chinking and rattling and all of this stuff, and you can't open the lid and look. You just take it on faith, like, it'll be okay. But it's nerve-wracking. Well, this is what you should hear going on. And this little guy is going to be rocking. You see how it's shaking? Well, on the All-American pressure canner, that is what they go by. Theirs is a weighted gauge on there, and it's supposed to be so many revolutions or so many tick-tocks per second. That's how they gauge it. On yours, when it's going, you have the dial to check, but also you can hear it. If you step out of the room, for a minute, you don't have to sit in front of it on a chair and watch it for 90 minutes. I've done that, but you don't have to, okay? It really is not going to explode. It won't. I promise you, it will not explode, especially if you kept your vent clean, all right? It's not gonna explode in your kitchen. But you're gonna hear this. When it starts to get really, really hot, like you're getting closer to 15 pounds, this thing is gonna sound like it's gonna take off. It's just gonna be, going all over the place, rocking back and forth. That lets you know, oh, I kind of have the heat turned up too high. Oh, there, back that off. And so you just back off the heat on the stove. That's all you have to do, all right? Just again, do not let it go below 11 psi. If it goes below, you have to reset your timer. And be careful of giant leaps and fluctuating temperatures, all right? You don't want the siphoning to occur. But that's it. And again, the timer, when the timer beeps, time is done, turn the timer off and the stove off, and that's it. Walk away. Leave it where it is on the burner. Don't touch it. Don't do anything to it. Hands off, walk away. You have to wait to see the final result until it's cooled off. And when that happens, steam will naturally vent on its own slowly, so no siphoning occurs. Okay, that's why. Let it cool on its own. As soon as the lock disengages, then you can take the lid off. All right? Keep in mind, there's still steam in here. It's still hot. It's not like, oh, it cooled off completely. No. All right, there's still hot steam inside there. When you twist, you're going to twist it off, take it off, and how I like to explain is just carefully pull back towards you. It's going to have water dripping, hot water dripping, and you'll see like a big poof of steam coming out. All right, just set your lid aside somewhere because it's still very hot. You don't want to actually touch it or knock it on the floor. And then you would get your jar clamps. You reach in and just one at a time carefully slide the jars out. I like to tip mine a little because they'll have water that's pooled up on the top. Just tip it and set it on a towel on the counter and let it sit overnight to cool. That's all you do. The next morning when you go to check it, that's when you're going to do your seal check. Did they all seal? You take your bands off. You check. Does it pop? Does it make any noise? If it doesn't, do your jar lift. Does the lid come off? And if everything is sealed, it's good. The other thing I like to explain is it goes back to the whole reuse your lids. Don't write with permanent marker on your lids. It's really annoying to have to scratch through it and rewrite. Use a wet dry erase marker. Really, really handy. Because then when you're done and you go to reuse it, when you pop that lid off, I just wipe it off and then throw it in the dishwasher. And it's good to go for the next one, and then I can write what it is. I try to write like what it is in a abbreviation and then the year, or if I'm making multiple batches during a year, I'll put the month and year, just so I can rotate my stock and always use the oldest first. And that's just a simple thing about the canning, but that's it in a nutshell. You see how fast and easy, it's so simple. You can do the same exact raw cold pack method, not using pre-cooked food. You don't have to pre-cook it. You don't. There is no scientific reason, absolutely nothing that they can prove that helps increase the flavor or make it safer to eat if you pre-cook it. Potatoes is another big one, sweet potatoes. They'll tell you, you peel them, you dice them, and you have to soak them so many times, rinse them. The idea is to get off as much starch as possible. But then they tell you, boil them for so many minutes. Then pack your jars. The only reason for doing that is because they want you to soften them so you can pack more into a jar. But when you've boiled potatoes, they've already started to soften. Then you put them in a pressure canner and you're gonna can them for, I think it's the same time, 90 minutes for a quart. They come out and it's like a gloopy, gloppy mess. It's just, they don't even taste good. So, using a red potato is the best potato for canning, just like using it in a baked potato or a potato salad, because it holds its shape better. Some potatoes are better than others. Some are just more mealy, like russet potatoes, have a tendency of getting mushy faster. So those are all different things you need to keep in mind when doing it. But you don't have to boil and pre-cook food. Your green beans, your carrots, your corn even, your peas, asparagus, your meat, dry beans, none of them have to be pre-cooked. You can raw pack, and it is so easy as washing, prepping, filling your jar, putting the water if called for, salt, lid, band, put it in the pressure cooker. That's it. So you can knock out lots of food in a short amount of time. The most time is the pressure canner itself, 90 minutes for it to go through its process, and then just let it set aside and cool. But if you're doing gardening and you've got several quarts full of green beans, I mean, maybe you pulled in like 10, 15 gallons of green beans and you've got them sitting there, you just get an assembly line going. That's where having lots of kids come in handy. You're like, okay, here's your bucket, and here's your bucket, and everybody lines up, and you're gonna do this, and you're gonna do that, and we start packing jars. We just clean them, we cut them, we pack our jars, and fill them with water. We've got salt in it, lids, but you can only do 7 at a time if you're doing 7 quarts. Well, I just make sure I clear out the space in my refrigerator, and I'll throw all the extra ones in the refrigerator. Or if I know that I'm going to be doing another batch that day, I'll just leave them on the counter. They won't spoil in a couple hours. They're really not going to spoil. And so I've already prepped my jars. As soon as the canner is cooled and I can take the lid off, it's safe to take the lid off, and I pull jars out, I put the next one in. Another one going. Just like that. But I'm not standing there. I'm not doing all that work, prepping and heating water and making sure I have a hot boiling pot of water on the stove, and I've got my canner going, and I've got all, you don't have to do all that. That's why I said it's so much easier than having to do the water bath canner, because water bath canning, you must sterilize your jars, you must sterilize your lids and bands, you have to have them hot, the ingredients have to be hot, the water canner has to be hot. That's a lot of things going hot on your stove. Hopefully you have enough space and you've got enough burners to do it. When you're pressure canning, the pressure canner is the only thing that's sitting on your stove. Nothing else has to be hot. Nothing. You're good. Raw packing is like the bomb diggity when it comes to canning. It is the life-saving time saver, and I love it. And you will love the texture of your food, how it turns out, and it's not mushy. I forgot to mention, if, with the chicken, you can do bone-in chicken. You can. It doesn't have to be boneless, skinless chicken breast. You can do chicken legs. You can do a whole chicken. Just what they tell you to do is cut it up first. All right? And then just keep in mind that because the density is different, the processing time will be different. All right? So it's the same animal. I mean, it's chicken. But because it has bone versus packed meat, the density changes. And I remember I told you, it's all about temperature and density. That's what you're looking for inside there. I do have a handout just so some of the key things that we discussed about canning safety, as well as like the hot and cold packing. The one thing I did not touch on a lot is altitude. Remember I said that there's 2 things in canning that you never adjust, would be your processing time and the head space. Well, with processing time, the only thing you would change when you're pressure canning it would be if your altitude is different. We don't deal with that because Arkansas is between 50 and 100 feet above sea level. We're kind of like flat. Now, if you were to move to a different state and you're up in the mountains, or maybe you live up on Mount Magazine, which I don't even think Mount Magazine is that high above sea level. But different places, the higher you get above sea level, the thinner the air is, which means that that's going to affect pressurization. So that's when you would have to adjust your recipe. The same thing would be true for hot water bath canning. You would have to adjust your time on there. So I've added that chart so you can see it. I've also added in for the different jar capacities for your canner, how many it'll hold, how to do those. Those are on there. And then on the back, there's some information about, just a reminder, always check the source, check with the guidelines, the professionals. When you find a recipe and it's like, okay, well, that sounds good. I think I want to try this. Before you do, just look it up. Look it up either in the your pressure book, if you have that, or go online and there's the guidelines. The one I've showed like snippets of. There's a PDF for everything under the sun. If you want to buy the book, where they just took all the individual PDFs and printed them and spiral bound it, they'll charge you $10. Otherwise, you can just print what you want or look it up on your phone if you want to do that. But that's just a quick guide. They're not going to give you necessarily a bunch of recipes, and that's why the ones that are approved, meaning they have been tested, laboratory tested, that's how you know they're good, is like the canning book. And just as a reminder, don't go with anything that is pre-1988. Sorry, but that's when they changed and they revised everything. And from that point on, many of the recipes that were supposedly safe that our grandparents used were taken out of the books because they couldn't get consistent results, and they decided that it wasn't safe. So just to be an informed consumer means that do your due diligence, do your research. I'm not going to stand here and tell you can't do that. Now, I can caution you and tell you what it says, that the guidelines say, but even what I showed you today and skipping the hot water, that was just something that after researching and piecing it all together, and I kept asking the question, why? They don't have a good, solid scientific reason for doing it. There is no health benefit to using boiling water on something. It's for cosmetic, or it's for the ability to pack more in a jar, which affects the texture of it. So I would be against that. So all of those things, and then I just weigh all those, I lay out all those pieces, and I weigh in the balance of, is it really worth it? Is it going to affect my health? What does it do at the time? How does it affect the texture? All of those things I examine, and then I make my decision of, I think it's worth to do it this way. And that's how I do it. So when you look at a recipe, use the knowledge you have. Make an informed decision for yourselves. Don't just trust anybody because, Aunt Susie on my mother's side's cousin's aunt, she did it this way. Oh, well, that's great, and bless their hearts, I'm so glad nobody died. But it is true, I'll throw this out there, that when, the whole Victory Garden and eat what you can and what you can't, that was like a big push by our government. They did find that the death rates from botulism skyrocketed. Many, many people died during that time because they were home canning and they didn't know what they were doing. So again, not having proper knowledge, even though you have the tools to do something, that's not the greatest. That is like the recipe for destruction. You need knowledge to go along with the tools to have the best results on there, to make good decisions for your family, to, yes, be able to save money, to make the best use of preserving food, but don't do it at the cost of taking a chance that you're going to harm yourself or harm somebody else. That kind of like, we don't want to kill our neighbors. So, and I kind of would like my kids to stick around for a while. I don't want them to die by applesauce. So that's just how it is. So, look at the guide, look at the recipes, weigh all that information out, and make your own decision on there. Did anybody have any questions during this time? Go ahead.
One of my canning books, it said to take that rubber ring and coat it with a thin coat of
Vaseline or oil? Yeah, I've heard of that before. I think the main reason they tell you to do that, if I'm correct, I can't quote anybody on it, but it was because it keeps it from drying out. That was the big thing. The concern that I've had seeing that is it can kind of get gunky over time, and like dirt and everything will attach. Like I said, this thing is a decade old, and I use it monthly, just about monthly. As long as you dry it good, just keep it clean and dry, you're okay. And I will mention that when you store your pressure canner, don't store it like this, where it's sealed. That will wear out the ring. A lot of people, when they store it in their closets, they'll take this part off, just put it on the inside, and they store it upside down. That way, it doesn't put excess pressure on the ring. Mine, because I'm lazy and I don't like to de-dust it. So when I have to use it again, when I put it in my cabinet, I just always leave it to where, let's see if I can get it on here. I leave it like that. I mean, because it's on, it's just resting on there, but it's not tight. It's not squishing it down, it's not sealing it. And therefore, I don't have to worry about dust getting inside. I don't have to wash it and, scrub it. This part, I'll just wipe down, just to make sure it's clean. And then when I examine this part, I will note that in a lot of canning books, they tell you to add 1 to 2 tablespoons of white distilled vinegar to the water, whether it's the water bath canner or your pressure canner. They'll tell you to put vinegar in there. My only negative thing about that, because they say that the reason is it will keep your jars from being cloudy. The outside, if you've got hard water, it'll keep them from having that cloudiness on there. The downside to it is when you heat vinegar, especially if you have hard water, it will eat through metal. I mean, it disintegrates my bands, my canning bands, which I reuse. Well, after 1 or 2 uses, when I put that vinegar in there, yeah, I might have sparkling jars, but my bands, I can't reuse them. I got to chunk them in the trash. So in my opinion, I'm like, I don't care if my jars are cloudy or, what they look like. As long as it's sealed, the food is good, texture is good, I just want to be able to reuse my bands. So I do not put vinegar in my water. I don't. That's just something that I honest to goodness do not know why they say that is the recommended thing. It does nothing to sterilize. It's just supposedly supposed to help keep cloudiness from, on the outside of the jar. It doesn't even affect the contents. So what's the big deal? But vinegar does corrode. I mean, it will corrode metal. So in my opinion, I'm like, no. And we have hard well water. I mean, it will eat through anything. And I've been noticing on mine, the only wear and tear I've noticed is because the water spits out here when it starts steaming. My water with those minerals is so hard, it's almost like it starts to eat away at the metal. So I need to put a reminder for myself is to use sterilized water, distilled water, or filtered water, which will help it not do that. If you have city water, you should be good. Just as a reminder, the liquid you put into your jars when canning needs to be clean water. Don't use tap water. Use distilled water, or if you have a Berkey or a filtration system, use filtered water. You don't want to get chlorine and fluoride? You don't want any of that getting in your jars. And if you have well water, you definitely don't want well water inside there. It's gonna look pretty nasty as it turns brown from the minerals sitting. So those are just some tips about that. But yeah, the sealing ring, some people do, and they say it works. A lot of people are like, in my opinion, I don't think it's necessary if you properly care for it. So, any other questions on that?
Another question. Okay, when you double the jars that are in the pressure canner, do you extend the time that your pressure in or?
No, you don't. And that's the crazy thing. It doesn't matter if you have 1 jar in there or 20 jars in there. It's the same processing time, the same amount of water you fill it with. You do not change anything. The only time you have to change your water level is in a water bath canner because, remember, 1 to 2 inches above the tallest jar. So if you have 1 jar in there, you're going to fill a lot more water to cover it. The more jars you have, the more volume it takes up, which means you need less water because it'll raise as you keep filling it. But if you have 1 jar, you got to have a lot more water. With the pressure canner, this is important. Never, ever, ever overfill your pressure canner with water. Read your manual. And I'm pretty sure that whether it's a 16 quart, a 20 quart, or a 23 quart pressure canner, it's always 3 quarts of water. All right? To double check that, let me unpack it so I can show you in here. It will say inside your pressure canner manual, which if you got a used one, you found it at a garage sale or you bought it online, and you're not sure, download the manual online. You can find the Presto canner manuals, and it will tell you. All the way in the bottom of your pot, you have these lines. The bottom line, it's really hard to see, but there's a little, like, cut out in there. You can pass it around, some of them. You see there's one, it looks like this. Can you see that? It's kind of like a little scratch, a little indentation. There is one all the way at the bottom, which is about 2 inches above the bottom of the pressure cooker. And that, or pressure canner, I'm sorry, that is kind of the guide. But if you just have a quart jar, you can use that quart jar and just fill it. It's 3 quarts. And your manual will tell you. Know your manual. Because there are different models out there, okay? This is the Presto brand. And we use a weight with a dial gauge. The All-American doesn't have any rubberized seals. It's got like these bolts on the side. It's all metal. I mean, it weighs a ton. It's a beast. But you like bolt down everything on there, and then you wait for it to reach pressure, and you put the weight on there. It's either 5 pounds, 10 pounds, 15 pounds. And it like has the little numbers on it, and that's the weight you put on there, and that's where it goes. And it goes by like how many times per minute it rocks, and like all of these things. But that's like the Ferrari in the world of canning. The All-American canners cost around $375, whereas now the price for a 23-quart Presto canner is about $150. So that's the biggest difference between them. Let's see, what else? Just the water. 1 to 2 inches above top of the headspace for water canners. Pressure canner, always 3 quarts of water. And that's it. And to explain that, there was a video I watched, and this lady was explaining how she bought this pressure canner at a garage sale, and she thought she knew how to use it. She'd never pressure canned before, and she ended up in the hospital for, I can't even remember how many months she said, on life support. She got botulism because she thought that you did it like a pressure or a water bath canner, and she covered her jars with water. Again, the difference, we're not water bath canning, we are pressure canning. Pressure is key because of the heat. So when her jars were covered with water, it never pressurized. Even though the dial said that it came to pressure, it hadn't. So she had a false reading on there, and she thought it was safe to eat it. She ended up in the hospital, almost died. And she was like, listen, you know, here's some key points. Know your manual, read your manual. And she's like, and I didn't have a manual. She didn't get one. She just thought, oh, well, you know, I can do this. I've canned before. There's some key things you need to remember. Don't be afraid of something. Be aware and be informed. And when you have knowledge and you're informed of something, you know how to handle it. You can be cautious. There's a difference between caution and fear. All right, fear can cripple you and keep you from doing anything. Caution makes you aware of what could happen, and you start thinking through it. But yes, sir. You can. That's a good point. You can take a water canning recipe and convert it to a pressure canner, but you can never take a pressure canning recipe and convert it to water bath, because it all goes back to the temperatures, okay? Always remember, water only heats to 212 degrees Fahrenheit, where the pressure canner gets up to 240. It must be at that proper temperature in order to kill off the botulism spores that grow in there. So just keep in mind, it can go one way, but it cannot go the other way. So, any other questions on this?
Could you add meat or something to the beans, or would you have to find a different recipe?
Yes, that's a good question. Some people add bacon to it. Now, there are recipes out there for, like in the canning book, they'll have for baked beans. And I've tried to research more, because they'll do a hot pack method. When they do baked beans, they actually bake them. Like, they bake them a long time, and then they just preserve the baked beans. Instead of putting it all in the refrigerator to last, they'll portion it out in their jars and pressure cook it. And then, so it's cooking it a little bit longer, but it's preserving it. And then they put it on their shelves. But all of the work to make it, they've done in advance. It would kind of be a concept of, you made a big batch of spaghetti, and then instead of portioning it out and freezing it to preserve it, you portioned it out in jars and canned it and just put it on your shelf. Not that you would do that with spaghetti, though.
Couldn't you just put some ham in there if you wanted to?
I've heard, yes, some people will just take like a chunk of ham to put in with the beans to flavor it, because again, canning chicken and meat is the same canning time as dried beans. I've not done it myself yet, so I can't attest to it, but I do know that as long as the canning pressure is the same, Just compensate for the amount of beans you will put in there and water, because the beans need enough space and the water to expand. So if you are filling that space with a chunk of meat, take out some of the beans, okay? Because you're not going to be able to put as much water in there. And the biggest thing with beans is you don't want to overfill your jar, because they will expand and you'll have leaking, and no jars will seal. So you don't want that.
Can you use any jars that the lids fit, or do you have to use canning jars? Like pickle jars?
It's a good question. Yeah, the recycled, I think some of the ones I have on my shelf from my mom and grandma are old mayonnaise jars. Now, I know they tell you it's not recommended to do that because they're not made to withstand high amounts of heat. I don't know, the ones that have broken, in my experience, I just always attested it to, they start to age faster. The glass will get brittle when it's stored, like if the temperature keeps fluctuating, you know, like if it's in an outside garage and it's really hot and then really cold, then really hot, then really cold, or in direct sunlight, glass does become brittle. And then when you go to heat it under those high pressurized heat temperatures, it can cause it to break. I've only had maybe 2 or 3 jars do that in all of the hundreds and hundreds of jars I've canned. It doesn't happen very often, but it can. But yeah, I recycle jars. My sister recycled for a Christmas gift. She'd been buying spaghetti sauce from Sam's Club, and they all came in these little, they weren't quarts necessarily, but they were the spaghetti size, maybe 28 ounce, I think is what it was. And it has like the Atlas, the old-fashioned looking thing, but they fit the ball lids and bands. So she just made homemade spaghetti. She made my mom's spaghetti recipe and then cleaned all the jars and refilled them and gave them as Christmas gifts to all her neighbors. She had like this whole counter full of them. But she reused the jars because they're still perfectly good. A good solid glass jar will last, and if it has the band on it and will fit a regular standard lid and band, then yes, you can technically reuse it. But I just have to tell you, the professionals say not to. I have not personally. I'm about to, though. I haven't run out of freezer space yet. We eat it too fast. It's kind of sad. But when you get large amounts of meat, then yes, you can pressure can fish, beef. Our friend at church likes to make pot roasts in there. I remember when I had baby number 4, she brought over as a meal. She's like, "Here's some jars." It was like meals in a jar, and I just like dumped it out, heated it up. It was great. So tender, just melt in your mouth. I mean, just amazing meals that you can do. But this new one was, we had a bunch of pork still in the freezer from the last hog we butchered, and I know we're getting ready for butchering season again, and I'm like, I gotta clean out the freezer. So one of the things to do is just thawed a bunch of it, chopped it all up, threw it in the jars, and canned it. So now I've got pulled pork. It's just cubes, so all I have to do is strain it off, reheat it, throw some barbecue sauce on it, or throw it in a casserole or whatever. I've got cooked meat. And I experimented and I added a little bit extra salt because pork doesn't have as good a flavor as chicken. I don't know why. It doesn't retain flavor as well. The chicken, the juice from the chicken, it's just rich tasting. It's very rich tasting. That's why I said it makes the greatest broth. And you don't add any liquid to it. This is what's going into the canner, and yet when it comes out, you can shake it. There's all that liquid. That's broth. Pure chicken broth, straight out of the meat. You can't get any better than that. I mean, you really, really can't. So, and then the same is with the pork. Pork has a little bit more fat on it, so you have to trim. It takes more time to trim the fat off and cut it up, just so. But when you dump it out, put whatever sauce on it, heat it up in the stove or the oven, and you've got a meal right there. And it got rid of it out of my freezer, so now I have freezer space for a hamburger. But people do hamburger patties, again, wide mouth jars. They make it to where it'll fit right down in the jar, and they use pieces of parchment paper in between. And it pre-cooks the hamburger patty. And so then when they're ready, they just pull them out, separate them, reheat them. Sky's the limit. I mean, you can get really, really creative on this. You can can fish. I've not done that. I know you can. And now understanding the principles of it, it's like, oh, I could see how doing that, the steps to doing it and what needs to happen in there. We've done pork now, we've done chicken, you can do deer, basically any protein source you can pressure can. And then depending on what you add to it, the ingredients will change your recipe. Remember how I mentioned salsa? Tomatoes are technically it's on the border. They're considered a high acid food, so they can be water bath. But when you start adding in bell peppers, onions, jalapeno peppers, you start adding in all of these other ingredients to the salsa, those ingredients are low acid. Meaning, if you have more low acid ingredients mixed in with the high acid, it turns it to low acid, and therefore you have to pressure can it instead of water bath canning it. So you play around with that idea. The ingredients you add to something, if it's a water bath recipe, it might change it to where you would be on the safe side to go ahead and pressure can it.
Other than the pickling salt, can you put any other seasonings in, or?
You can. Now, I got this one just because this year I am, fingers crossed, I am hoping we're going to get a bumper crop of pickles. That's what I'm hoping. So I wanted to make sure I had that on hand. I honestly have always just used my table salt, Morton's salt. And everything I've been reading now and prepping for this class to make sure I don't say something incorrectly is like, never use Morton's salt. I'm like, what? They're like, I use pink Himalayan salt, or I use, such and salt, because they add an anticoagulant to it. Canning pickling salt does not have that in there, and neither does like the all-natural Redmond's red salts. They don't. It's just.
You would put some pepper or something in there with it, lemon pepper, whatever.
Yeah, you can. It's not going to change it. I'll double check on it because I don't want to speak incorrectly, but I'm pretty sure seasonings are going to be fine. Your pressure canning it is going to be the same. 90 minutes at the same thing. The biggest difference is if you're adding it to a water bath canning recipe and it changes it. That would be where you want to be really careful of the ingredients you add, because it can change the acidity level. So, any other questions? Anything? Well, I thank you guys all so much for coming out.